So ecopsychology is a massive, massive subject, right? If you think about ecology, as John Muir famously said, it's the study of relationships, the study of everything, how everything connects together. So really, ecology, if it's a study of relationships and everything's connected to everything else, then it is the study of absolutely everything. And mostly when we think of ecology, we think about physical ecology. We think about plants and animals and forests and trees and the ocean and so on. But of course, if you're a human being, you also have metaphysical relationships with the environment. Environments, as we were discussing a minute ago, you were sharing experiences of childhood. And if we explored that more, you'd probably start to say there were places that felt safe and places that felt dangerous. There were places that you loved. There were places that you didn't like. You would describe all these emotional responses to place, to physical places. So that means we have metaphysical relationships with places. We have intangible relationships, unseen relationships to the rest of nature. And that really is the world of ecopsychology. So if you take the whole physical world and then you take the whole metaphysical world, that's the concern of ecopsychology, is how all that fits together. So really it's an enormous subject. So big, in fact, that it doesn't really make sense. It's too big to get our heads around. So what I'm going to do is just break it down a little bit. So the definition that I like best for ecopsychology is that it's psychology applied to ecological issues, right? Just that. It's looking at, for example, our ecological crises through the lens of psychology. What does psychology bring to that view? How does psychology help us understand? So it's a transdiscipline, which means that it includes many, many other disciplines. Within ecology and within ecopsychology, um, because we're talking about human ecology, that therefore means we're talking about sociology, we're talking about politics, we're talking about economics, we're talking about biology, we're talking about spirituality. They can all be part of ecopsychology. So it's an enormous field, and people come at it from lots of different directions and have lots of different interests and lots of different ideas about what it is. Now, a really important point for me that I want to make today is that ecopsychology is not just about outdoor experiences. That is a big assumption, is that it's just about the psychology of being outdoors. Now, outdoor experiences are a phenomenal tool for applying ecopsychology. And in fact, that's my specialist field, is how do we use outdoor experiences to apply ecopsychology? But it's not the whole of ecopsychology. And that's really important. You know, ecopsychology really is about using psychology as a tool for meeting the challenges of ecological crises, which is very broad. Right? So that's a little summary of a definition. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about, which we've already touched on with the idea of the ecological self. So thanks very much for that question. It was a good frame. Is that at the heart of ecopsychology is the simple fact that humans are part of the rest of nature. Now, I'm sure that all of you understand that and see that. And that's the work, that's our work, I think, in the environmental movement. Human beings are part of the rest of nature. It's absolutely phenomenal to think that our entire industrial growth culture completely ignores that fact. It's a culture that's built despite that fact. But if you just try holding your breath for 30 minutes, you find out very, very quickly that we are part of the rest of nature. We're part of it. It's probably the easiest and simplest experiment we could do as animals is to hold our breath and realize that we completely depend on our environment for our existence. And yet we've managed to evolve in the industrial West anyway. We've managed to evolve a culture that behaves like that just isn't a fact. That isn't true. It's remarkable. And that's not a technological problem or a technological issue. That's a psychological issue. Why do we think we're separate from and superior to the rest of nature? Why? So really what the work of ecopsychology is about matching our biological reality, that we are animals living in ecosystems, with our psychological reality of how we understand ourselves. And the moment those two things don't match in our culture, and ecopsychology is trying to bring those two things together. So that we feel like we're part of the rest of nature. We understand we're part of the rest of nature, and we experience the world as if we are part of the rest of nature. Because if that is so, then we also will behave as if we're part of the rest of nature. And that means that we have to live in a sustainable way. That's how that has to happen. If we don't, we are, well, understanding and experiencing that we're part of the rest of nature and behaving that way is the ultimate act of survival, really. And I think what we're seeing happening now is that our psychology and our biology are separating out, and the one is undermining the other, and we're ending up in a situation where we won't survive. We just won't survive. So it's a question of of identity, of us understanding who and what we are. So what is a big problem is when our culture tries to sell us the idea, literally, that we're separate from nature. And you see it everywhere. It's everywhere. In the media and advertising, in language, in education, in politics, in science, it's everywhere. This idea that we're separate from nature. Even one of WWF's logos, people and nature, that slogan, people and nature, separates people from nature. You shouldn't need the and. So it's even within the environmental movement, it's a dominant force that our language separates us from the rest of nature. So for me, in a big piece of ecopsychology is around language. It's around narrative. It's around, like, there's a really interesting new field of inquiry around ecolinguistics, which is about the language we use to describe what's happening to us on a planetary scale. And that language is not just spoken or written, it's also visual. We see that all the time in the imagery that we experience in our culture. Another way that this separation from nature happens is through the way we frame language, like metaphors that we use and phrases that we use. And there's been some amazing work done by people like George Lakoff around cognitive framing, that helps us understand the way we frame how we communicate about nature and the impact that that has. So that's the first piece, is about the technical word for it is non-duality, but the description of it is we are part of the rest of nature. In fact, we are nature. So the next little piece I'd like to talk about is actually the next two pieces really are often overlooked as aspects of ecopsychology, but they're really, really important. And I'm also going to give you some examples of this work in action, because I've been lucky enough to do quite a lot of work in these fields, these two fields, over the last couple of years. One thing that ecopsychology is very good for is what I've described as kind of cultural diagnosis. So it's like we can, just like a psychologist might diagnose a patient or a client, we can do that to our entire industrial culture. It can be used as a tool. Psychology can be used as a tool. You know, the big question, I guess, is why do we carry on living in unsustainable ways when we know what's happening and we have all the technology and resources we need to live sustainably? Why do we just carry on? And this is not a technical issue, it's a psychological issue. You know, it's almost like our culture is self-harming. It's almost like our culture is suicidal. We are literally soaring off the branch of the tree that we're sitting on. And we know that. And for those of us in this movement, in the environmental movement, it's an incredibly traumatic and painful experience to know that and to watch and witness that happening around us. But why do we do it? That question can't be answered with more technology or more science. It can only be answered by understanding our psychology and our cultural psychology. You know, and I guess if you think about in psychology, if you think about why people are suicidal or why they harm themselves, it's nearly always due to trauma, to some experience of trauma. So what trauma have we experienced as a culture that's led us to be like this? What's been going on? What's happened? And you know, the next question really is how do we treat that? And there are lots and lots of ways that if you went to see a psychologist or a psychotherapist, you presented with some of these symptoms, you talked about traumas you'd experienced. There are ways of working with that can be very successful. So what can we learn from that process about changing the way we live and living in a more sustainable way? So as an example of this, did a big project for a global environmental NGO that finished last May. It was about an 18-month-long program. And it was a multifaceted project, but the core of it was trying to understand what we described in the program as the status quo mindset. So what we're interested in there is what mindset have we got in our industrial culture that's maintaining the status quo that we live in? It's maintaining our unsustainable culture. It's stopping us from changing. What's going on in our minds, like either that we're aware of consciously or unconsciously, what hidden processes are happening that are stopping us from changing? And the way we did that is we built profiles of lots of different people, and this was done using focus groups, various other desk research techniques and so on, looking at the media, looking at the way people presented themselves in public. And we built some profiles and different social groupings and tried to understand what the characteristics were of the mindset that stopped these groups of people from changing their behavior. So it's kind of a diagnosing our mindset. And then what we did is we said, well, look, what kind of mindset would be living sustainably? What would we be thinking? How would we structure our thoughts? What self-concepts would we have if we lived in a world that was sustainable? So we started to map that out as well. And that's very interesting and very complicated because there are a lot of ethical questions about in that area about how we should or shouldn't live, what we prioritize. And then, of course, once we got an idea of the status quo mindset and we got an idea of an ecological mindset, the next obvious question is how do you move from one to the other? So then we started devising and coming up with various different ways of doing that. One of which, of course, was through facilitated outdoor experiences, how to shift mindsets that way, which we'll talk about in a minute. But another big strand was communications. And we particularly looked at how to apply that to campaigning. So what communications techniques can campaigners use to engage stakeholders and also to, I guess, to challenge and respond to confrontation and to people who are putting forward an opposite view. So that was very interesting to come up with some recommendations around communications. And that was all done. So that's all that kind of second piece, which is all about diagnosing our culture and then using different psychological techniques to respond. So I hope you're all still with me there. It's very difficult. I can't see any faces, but the ones I can see, I hope that makes sense. Obviously, there is lots of terrain here that can get very, very academic and technical potentially, and I'm trying to avoid that as much as possible. So I hope it all makes sense. So let's look at there's kind of the next third, which is about technique. So ecopsychology, just like psychology has its clinical psychology and has its psychotherapy and its counseling, ecopsychology has a whole range of techniques that we can use. And really this is kind of coming more really squarely into the work I do most of the time, where the application of ecopsychology is loosely referred to as ecotherapy. So we're moving to the practice. How do you apply ecopsychology? And that field is usually called ecotherapy. And I guess one of the classic ways of using that, for me anyway, is by taking people outdoors and working with them to give them an experience of themselves as part of the rest of nature, which is somatic, is in their body. Okay, we can sit here now, all of us, and I'm sure all of you have read lots of books and listened to lots of lectures. I'm sure a lot of you have studied. You've probably got degrees or perhaps even postgraduate qualifications in subjects related to the environment. You probably have a very deep intellectual understanding of lots of different issues. The science of global warming, for example, understanding biodiversity. You probably have an incredible intellectual store there, understanding of these issues. My question would be, how do those issues feel? How do they feel? Right. How do they feel when you think about what's happening to our planet? What happens in your body? What physical response do you have? So these are eco-psychological questions. And what I found is that it doesn't matter how much time you spend reading and studying and lecturing and talking and debating these issues. It doesn't matter how much you do that. Nothing is more powerful than an embodied somatic experience of yourself as part of the rest of nature. It's like a shortcut through. And what it does is it gives people this deep understanding about themselves, even to the point where they can't even describe their understanding. It's beyond understanding. It's inside their bodies. It's in their bodies. That's really important. That's one of the powerful things that outdoor work can do. And what I find is once you've had that experience, that kind of experience, it's very difficult to not want to live sustainably. It's very difficult to live in our present culture without doing something, without trying to change something. But it's not done through an intellectual understanding, which is why the outdoor work is so powerful. A metaphor I really like is, imagine if you were going to try and learn to swim and all you had was a book about swimming, right? That's not going to work. It doesn't matter how if you even learn that book off by heart, you're still not going to be able to swim. You have to get in the water. And I think the same applies here, is that we need to get our bodies into those big wild ecosystems in order to really deeply understand that we're part of the rest of nature. You know, for me, learning for sustainability, for example, unless it involves some kind of direct experiences of the more than human world, it cannot work. It cannot work. So learning for sustainability, for me, has to include outdoor experience. Otherwise, you're just making it really hard for yourself. I sometimes get asked, why do you work outdoors? Why do you do that? It seems like a lot of effort. And I say, because for me, it's the easiest way of creating environmentalists. It is the easiest way of doing it. So outdoor work is an important piece of the thread. The other thing that is really helpful, I think, are what I've described here as countercultural practices. So we're going to go back to this. I mentioned earlier about the importance of the way different things are framed in our culture, and how language is really important in creating change. So I'm going to tell you a little story, a little example of that. If you imagine that a group of young army recruits, they turn up in a car park on a mountainside somewhere, and they're going to spend their day climbing to the summit of the mountain in order to learn how to navigate in mountainous terrain. That's what their day is. If you can just imagine that, imagine the scene. They're getting ready to go. They're going to go off onto the path and they're going to head up the mountain. They're going to be looking at maps and compasses, and they're going to be told what to do. They're going to be taught new bits of information. That's their day. Now, if you imagine the exact same day, it's the same car park, it's the same mountain, the weather is the same, the terrain is the same, the season is the same, everything's the same, except the group that are going to climb to the summit of the mountain are Zen Buddhist monks. And they're going to the summit of the mountain to do a meditation to the mountain. So the content of those 2 days are the same, but the experience that comes out of those 2 days is completely different, because the frame is different. One frame is about learning to navigate as an army recruit. The other frame is about a meditation to the mountain. Can you imagine how different the experience of that mountain is going to be, depending on which group you're in? That's how framing works. How we frame environmental issues. If we frame it like, for example, as that we're at war with nature, for example, that's a good one. Then that creates a certain way of thinking about nature as a threat that needs to be countered. But we might frame it differently. We might say, we're part of nature, or we're in harmony with nature, or we're interdependent with nature, and that creates a completely different experience of nature. So this idea of framing is very important, and what I was talking about there was how do we break the frame? How do we break one frame and create another one? A really good frame in our culture is that nature is resource. Nature is resource. So the rest of nature is there for us to use to live our lives, right? That's one frame. How do we break that frame? Because if we have that frame, we just live unsustainably. We just consume nature. How do we break that frame? And how do we make a new frame? How do we do that? So one of the ways of doing that is to challenge our culture very actively, all the time challenging it. Why are we using this language? Why are we using that language? If we always learn about sustainability in a classroom in a building somewhere, then go somewhere else. Go outdoors. Do it in a forest. You're breaking the frame. If we always presentations like this, if we do these, we always have PowerPoint slides and breakout rooms, then do it without PowerPoint slides and breakout rooms. You do the opposite all the time, changing the frame. And there's been a lot of work has been done about this in the educational sector that I'm sure you're aware of. David Orr famously was very famous in this regard with his work around ecoliteracy, and way back in the day, the whole Earth education work was very much about breaking our current cultural frames, do things differently. If you're going to have a meeting, go and do it, go and do it somewhere else. You know, I don't know, do it whilst knitting, do something different, break the frame. This is a really good technique. Okay. So, um, you know, just to look at some specific techniques in psychotherapy, somebody comes to you and they're struggling with some symptoms, psychological symptoms. In psychotherapy, what you do is talk about it, right? It's the word, as it's known, with a capital T and a capital W, the word. And there are many techniques that have developed around just using conversation, using dialogue, or even just sitting together, being with people in a certain space for a while, that are really powerful tools for working with psychological issues. And the number one, I often get asked, well, how do we respond to things like eco-anxiety and climate grief and solastalgia and some of these ideas? How do we respond to that? And people often expect me to say go outside, and I usually do at some point. But one of the first things I say is talk about it. Create safe, supportive environments where we can talk about these things. No, it's not what do we know about global warming? How do we feel about global warming? And how can we create spaces where we can have those conversations without feeling like people don't want to listen because it sounds like you're moaning, or where people will listen carefully to what you say, where people will respect your opinion and how you feel, where you can cry if you want to, you can be silent if you want to. Um, all those things are okay. There's no judgment. They're just benign spaces where you can talk. And I think that is amazing how often that gets missed. I always love whenever I have a meeting where maybe it's quite it's a formal meeting where there are lots of people discussing a particular issue or how to do something. I love finishing a meeting by, once everything's quietened down, saying, so, how do you feel? How do you feel? It's the ultimate psychotherapist question. How do you feel? So it's incredibly powerful. That's something you could start straight away. Once you've had all the technical conversations, you could just ask that question at the end. Um, and I guess alongside it fits in the outdoor work as well, but there's a lot about building communities around this work as well. I always think group work and creative process and so on are really powerful tools for engaging with that somatic and felt sense side of ourselves. I think working in community is especially important there, because it's supportive as much as anything else. But finding and creating communities, these aren't things that people often think of as being about eco-psychology, but this is how in psychology you would work. You would, in group therapy, for example, using really deep engaging processes in a group format is the bread and butter of group therapy. So you could bring that into learning for sustainability in a really powerful way. And as practitioners, another really powerful way of breaking frames and reframing things and challenging things and being countercultural is what we role model. Is how we are. This is a big piece of my work is facilitator training, doing this kind of stuff. So helping people train to facilitate these kinds of processes, especially outdoors, but not just outdoors. And we spend a long time looking at how we individually embody a way of being that allows us to experience ourselves differently in the world. Um, how we interact with other people, how we respond to stakeholders and clients and staff, all these things are part of a narrative that changes the frame. Okay. Um, what I would, let's see where we're up to time wise. Okay, so we've about another 15 minutes, I'm thinking, before the break. Is that correct? Yeah. So I'm
Yes.
just going to give you I'm going to give you a little example that brings all these things together in one project. And this project's quite old now, but I've chosen it because it was funded and commissioned by WWF in Scotland in 2008 and 2010. And I don't know if any of you ever heard of it. It always strikes me that it was a long time ago now, but it was called the Natural Change Project. And it was through a presentation about that work that I first met Nathan in Switzerland some years ago now. And so it's probably the reason why I'm here right now. So it feels like a good place. The other really beautiful thing about natural change is that it brings so many things together in one example in a very beautiful way. So the story goes that a woman came on a course I was running in Scotland, and the course was about how to facilitate therapeutic outdoor experiences. And the woman turned out to be on the communications team at WWF Scotland. And she came on the course in her own time. She took holiday and she paid for it herself. And she had a really amazing experience that week up in the northwest coast of Scotland. And she had an idea. What if we could bring leaders, people in leadership roles in Scottish society, bring them together, take them through this kind of experience, and then get them to write about their experience and communicate about their experience within Scottish society in order to normalize, this was the important part, in order to normalize conversations about sustainability, in order to make it a topic that we could discuss in the pub or in the restaurant or at dinner with our families. It was something we talked about. It wasn't something that we ignored. And so we did. And the brief was design, Dave, please could you design this program with and just design it exactly as you would. She said it's really important that you just do exactly what you want to do. It doesn't have to be like anything you've done in the past. Just come up with the very best version of what you would like to do. So we designed a program that actually ended up running for nearly a year. It involved 21 days of time outdoors in 3 different blocks. The first program we did, we recruited people from different sectors in Scottish society, but the rule was that they all had to be in positions of power. They all had to have power and influence. And we had, I think the youngest person was 26 years old, and I would say the oldest person was probably in their 60s. And they came from the corporate sector, from arts and culture, from education, from students and youth, um, uh, from academia. So they were really diverse. And we took them through the process. And the deal was that they would go on these experiences. And then after they, or whenever they wanted to, they would then write blog posts about their experience. And this was at a time when blogging had just come out. It was a new thing then, unbelievably. So, and they would then distribute their blogs to their communities of practice. Anyway, it worked really, really well. It had an amazing impact. It went. It was very difficult to measure the outcome of it because there were so many outcomes, and they went in so many ways, and they also took lots of different amounts of times. So some things happened, some personal stuff happened quite quickly, but some of the really big long-term change didn't happen for 4 or 5 years after the program. It was very, very interesting. And we learned an enormous amount about how social change works. It doesn't go from A to B. You can't track it from one, somebody did this and then that happened. It goes from A to everywhere like that and diffuses out. It's very interesting. Anyway, that project was really successful. We did a presentation in the Tramway Theatre in Glasgow where the participants stood up one at a time and told a story about their experience. And I must say it was one of the most moving experiences of my life to watch these people speak from their hearts about their experiences on the side of a mountain or on the beach, or all of them spent 24 hours alone in a place out in the wilds of Scotland. They all came back and told their stories of their experience. We did lots of work. We did group work, we did one-to-one work, we did creative process, there was coaching work. Yeah, just lots and lots of different practices and activities all woven together over this long period of time. We had meetings back in the city as well as out in the wilds. And then those people stood up in the theatre and they spoke, and it was incredibly moving. And as a result of that project, WWF in Scotland went and raised, I think, 3 times the budget of the first one. And they decided to do it again, but this time to apply it specifically to a specific strategic aim, which was to influence educational policy in Scotland. And the Scottish government at that time were in the process of rewriting the national curriculum. So we got 11 leaders from education and we took them through a 9-month process. And as a result of that, we had a direct impact on that curriculum. And Scotland is still the only country in the world with learning for sustainability as a core curriculum element at school. And that natural change project impacts 1.6 million school children a year, right? That's from taking 11 people outdoors. That's how it worked. And working with these processes. That's it. That's the story. That's an example. So what that did there is the foundation of that whole process, the way it was designed around non-duality. It was designed around the ecological self. How do we give people an experience of themselves as part of the rest of nature? That was it. That was the core of it. The next thing was, how do we help them understand what's wrong with our culture? How do we enable them to critique our culture, to scrutinize it and work out what's going wrong and why? And then how do we give them tools and techniques to try and work with what's wrong with it, to try and engage people they couldn't previously engage, to try and use different language, to frame problems differently, to communicate differently about these issues. And really, we brought together, just like every technique we did. There was a lot of talking. We once worked out how many cups of tea we drank through the program because we spent so much time sitting in circles, usually outdoors, usually around a fire, drinking tea and just sharing our experiences and our feelings and describing what had happened to us, and also then being really creative and developing ideas and working out how we could move forward, what we could do. So it kind of brought the whole eco-psychology thing together. A big part of it was that there was a lot of trauma. We discovered a lot of people who, many of them weren't in the environmental movement, or they weren't involved in any way in sustainability before the program. As they started to engage with it, they started to experience the trauma of it. So, this was years before anybody used the word eco-anxiety or climate grief. We were working very, very deeply with those ideas and those concepts back in the late 40s, really. And helping people work out what to do with that. What do you do with that grief? What do you do with that feeling of frustration and hopelessness? Yes, you can go outside and it will feel better, but then it comes back again. And it's there. There needs to be a lot of different ways of working with it. We need real depth in the way we work with it. It requires constant effort, constant discipline, requires constant support, and also an ongoing building of community around it, around those experiences.
David, there are quite a few questions in the chat.
Yeah.
If I may, maybe it's better to start from the last ones. They are more practical, and maybe as you think best. But I think it's better to start from the more practical ones and move to the more theoretical ones.
Yeah. Okay.
And Hannah also has a question, Hannah? You want to phrase it now orally or?
Yeah, well, you can start from the questions. I'm walking here, so tapping my question on the mobile would be too difficult. So, but I can wait my turn. Very interesting.
Great, Hannah. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'll work from the bottom and see what happens. I think well, look, that's an interesting point. This about working from the bottom because the questions are more practical. I think we have a really in the environmental movement, there's a kind of there's just this huge priority on practical steps, things there has to be an action. And I think that what sometimes happens there is some steps before that get missed out because we're also keen to do something. We all want to act. And I wonder whether some of those actions would be more effective if there was more of a process to get to them. I'm wanting understanding ourselves and our own relationships to the rest of nature, having an opportunity to talk about how we feel about our own experiences of trauma in relation to the rest of nature. These are for me, these are way more important than if we can get some kind of practical step. It's like shifting the focus from the outcome to the process on the basis that if you get the process right, the outcome will take care of itself. So I didn't mean that directed to you at all, but it just struck me as isn't it interesting how in our culture we're very action focused, whereas maybe there's other stuff that we need to do to pay attention to before we get to the action. So that question about tools for communities, that's such a huge question, of course. My first response would be, it depends on the context of the community. Where is this community? Who's in it? What do they believe? What's their cosmology? What's their worldview? What's meaningful to them? So ultimately, where I get to is that I would want to ask them for their stories. I would want to go and listen to their stories. They're aware here that the question says they're moving from awareness to action. I would want to say, well, you're aware. So what are you aware of? How does that feel? What does that mean to you? That's where I would start with that. And I think in having that conversation, they would probably very quickly move to a place where they started to see what opportunities there were to take action. So I think that would be important. I think I would want to slow things down and connect in a much deeper way with people before doing anything. Again, it's like that thing. It's not an A to B thing. I don't think you can get from awareness to action just like that. I think it kind of goes like this. And so there's a whole story that has to be told in the middle of that. I think some of the best community projects are based around stories. Some of the best research methods are based around stories and communities, like most significant change analyses and those kinds of things. So yeah. Josh, there's more questions. Yeah, I like that. Memory mapping. That's a great one. I'm going to come to that last one later. Okay, let's have a look. So can we adapt the methodology from natural change to create resilient corporate partnerships? Yes, absolutely we can. And that there is some precedent for that. I've done some work in the corporate sector. And what they really love is the focus on leadership. They're interested in leadership, they're interested in innovation, and they're interested in trying to understand what the future is going to bring and how they can respond to that. So those are really good hooks for the corporate sector. I particularly focus on leadership and innovation. And a lot of them also really, interestingly, are quite engaged by the idea of doing something different. Doing something outdoors, for example, is quite attractive to a lot of organizations. There is the wisps of something happening in New Zealand at the moment around this, which is quite interesting. That may or may not involve WWF. I'm not sure yet, but yes. So yes, you can definitely adapt the methodology. It has been done. I've done a number of programs over the years. It's just a question. The big challenge with the corporate sector is getting access to the right people to engage them. That's the big challenge, which maybe WWF is well positioned for because you've got such a strong brand, which might give you access to some of these people. How do we create a wave of natural changes? That's about finding where the will to do it. So is there someone in senior leadership within the ENGO that was willing to engage with this approach, given that it is proven to be effective? The former director of WWF Scotland said it was the best return on investment in terms of stakeholder engagement that they ever had as a project, ever in the history of WWF Scotland. So it works really well, but because it's slightly different, because it uses the outdoors and because it uses psychology, there's a little bit of wariness about it. People are quite frightened of psychology, I think. So there tends to be I'm not quite sure about that. Are we manipulating people? Are we messing with their heads? Yes, we absolutely are. So there's a bit of that. So having the will to do it, right? People see it, they think, right, we need to do this. And then it's just a matter of the resources, getting the funding together. There's the people to do it. There's the capacity to do it. The program's there. Methodology works. It's just about that, will and funding. Yeah, that's a big question. We are part of nature, but is it in our nature and psychology to use nature for our own benefit? Yes, of course it is, but we are the only species that do that to the point of making ourselves extinct. Like consciously do that, Other species will consume their own environment and then the population will collapse, and that's more or less exactly what's going to happen to us. So it's probably in there, except for the fact that we're quite good at communicating with each other, and we are quite good at changing the way we do things. So we maybe as a species we have an opportunity to not do that. We know it happens, so maybe we can choose not to do it. So yeah.
David, sorry to interrupt. Thank you for that answer. But because I have posed 3 questions and I do not want to keep you only for my questions, please let's move into some other ones. One is very related to what we have discussed previously, so maybe you can answer that. It's about stories. If there are any resources, Paula asks that. One moment, I lost that. Yes, best tools to change communities to go from awareness to action.
Yeah, we talked about that one.
Sorry, some stories. There's another question. Okay.
Do you have resources?
Yes, that's one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, look. So, all right. The reason I hesitate is Nathan said that it was okay for me to talk about my Eco Self-Learning platform, which is an online learning platform. There is quite a lot on there about using stories, about storytelling. I think the main thing, the reason I'm hesitating is because it's quite complex. But the most important thing really, or what I find works really well, is providing some kind of shared group experience of something, and then creating a space for people to tell their stories of that. And I have a very particular process that I use for storytelling, which is quite disciplined and involves a reflective process. So people tell their stories, but there's also an opportunity for other people to reflect their stories back to them. So it's quite, and it's done in a group format. So yeah, that kind of process I think works extremely well. I think it needs to be well facilitated, really well held. And that's not necessarily very easy to do. I think you need some training and experience to be able to facilitate a story really well. But it's, honestly, human beings have been sitting around fires for 150,000 years at least, telling stories. That's what we do. We are storytelling animals. And any opportunity to tell a story or to listen to a story. I mean, look at, Shall we have a story? Everybody's immediately there. Yes, let's have a story. So it's incredibly powerful. And of course, as people hear each other's stories, they start to understand. Conflict starts to dissolve, commonality starts to emerge, language starts to get shared. So yeah, and I think any way you can find to create an opportunity for that is important.
Harari, the historian, says that this is the foundation of our civilization, storytelling. But shall we go? Yes, shall we go also to Ellen's question? Where there is a lot of uncertainty in the world and in an anthropocentric worldview, people seem to cling on to what is well known, even if it moves us in the direction of disaster. How can we create attractive future visions that don't scare people away?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, there needs to be an opportunity to explore the fear. It's the reason we cling to well-known things is because of fear. We're frightened of the future. So again, the response there has to be to explore that fear. If you went to see a counselor or psychotherapist and you were stuck, you were unable to respond, you didn't know what to do, that they would probably try and create a situation where you could explore the fear behind that. What's going on behind that? Why are you frightened? What's going on there? And it could even be, first of all, what are you feeling? What does it feel like? Where in your body do you feel it? If you do, is it in your chest here, tightness? You would explore the fear to start with, and that's the starting point. Because if you don't do that, then when it comes to trying to work out what's stopping people from responding, they can't respond. They can't answer that question because the fear has trapped them. The fear is already too big. So that's where I would go with that. I think the key word in that question is scare. What is scary? I want to know what that feels like. What does it feel like? What are you scared of?
Mm-hmm. Great. There's another question by Paula. I don't know if you think we have covered that as already. Let's see. What would be the best way to apply ecopsychology in an NGO like WWF? We discussed about natural change before, but are there any other ways you can think of and mention them now?
Absolutely. Yeah. So first of all, you start at a strategic level. Right from the very, very top, the very top is that trying to dissolve the dualism in the understanding of nature. So that at a strategic level, we are part of nature. So what does that mean about absolutely everything we do? What does it mean? How does it look in our communications, in our campaigning, in our fundraising, in our education programs? What does it look like if we assume that people are part of the rest of nature? How does that look? So there's a big strategic question there. In communications, how do you frame nature? Is it people and nature, which creates a dualism? Or is it people are nature, or people as nature, or we are nature? So, and that's communications then covers your websites, any printed material you use, advertising, any kind of campaign stuff, direct marketing you do to raise money. All that falls under comms. In education, thinking about pedagogy, do you teach? Do you do your educational work in a conventional classroom setting? And does that just undermine what you're trying to do? So how do you do your pedagogy? Is there space in your pedagogy to explore feelings and emotions as well as understanding and intellectual responses? Is all your education technical and solution based, or does it allow people an opportunity to not know what to do, to be overwhelmed, to be uncertain? Does it give them that opportunity? Campaigning, again, the language thing is really massive there. When you're thinking about engaging people in fundraising, you could the way you frame fundraising, what you raise funds for, how you language all that is really important. As we've discussed with natural change programs that you design, you know, do they promote an industrial growth cultural worldview by the way they're done, you know, or do they challenge that worldview? There's a thing that came up in the project we did that I mentioned earlier around mindsets. There's a thing called a conservation mindset, which is very interesting. The idea there is, and this is particularly prevalent in New Zealand, where you get people who live otherwise highly unsustainable lives who are very passionate about conservation, right? And because they are passionate about conservation, they think they are living sustainably. But what they're actually doing is undermining all the good work of their conservation by the way they live. So I would say that a lot of people who would donate money to conservation organizations fall into that category. So what's the psychology of that? Do they, at some level, do they feel guilty about their lifestyle? Are they ashamed at their consumerism? And what would happen if you started to unpick that and come up with some psychological strategies for helping people move beyond that? So that's a good one, the conservation mindset. And the other big one is about how much, as an organization, you behave in a consumerist way. So, you know, do you sell products? Are you promoting the idea that people can pay money and buy their way out of our ecological crises? Is that a good thing to do? Because you are promoting consumer culture, which is the culture you're actually trying to change. So are you contradicting yourself in the way you organize campaigns, fundraising, and stakeholder engagement in general terms? So that's just. Oh, and the other one I noticed, like on the WWF UK website, there's a section about well-being in nature, and it brings us right back to the kind of ecotherapy thing. Is there is a kind of this, if you think about it, a lot of these outdoor-based approaches to therapy are actually quite consumerist. People go out and they consume nature so they feel better, but nature still gets consumed. Nature is a resource that gets consumed for human beings to feel better. And it needs to be much more than that. The therapy, the healing needs to come because people understand that they're part of the rest of nature, and that, in fact, living as if we're part of the rest of nature is intrinsically healing. It's an important point, I think. So that would be that would be my response to that particular question. I have a couple of concluding things to say, but then otherwise.
One moment, because Hannah is waiting to pose her question.
Yes, before I forget it. Oh, thank you. It's been very, very inspirational to share this moment. So thank you, David, for being here with us. Me being a practitioner, working with children, youth, and adults also, I would like to know what kind of daily routines could we try to promote for children or youth or adults, so that, you know, we brush our teeth, we do everything, our daily routines. What kind of things could we have that would promote this thinking or make us more, you know, what could be beneficial for them to perhaps build their what would be beneficial for this cause? I mean, do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I suppose it might be a bit, you might expect I would say this, but go outside, like every day, spend some time outside, even if it's only 10 minutes. If you build that into your routine, I think that it just never fails. It just never fails. And if you live in an urban environment, go looking, go and find a tree, go and find go and look, go and find some soil. I can remember being in the middle of Singapore and just finding some soil was this beautiful moment. And I picked just like, in the street, there was a tree planted in the paving stones and there was some soil. And I just remember smelling the soil. So that's what I would say is try and build in some outdoor time every day.
I'm glad you gave that advice, because I have a next question. because you might not be able to go out there. You might be perhaps stuck in your house. I mean, you might be disabled in some sort. I've found out that it's quite nice for people of any age to have house plants and build connection to these other beings. So, any advice how we could perhaps make those practitioners more effective or better experience for both for the plant and for the human being?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, I was just talking to a friend last week, actually. He was telling me about a really beautiful project where they wanted to work with people using in a horticultural therapy context. Okay, so they were looking at gardening as a therapeutic tool. Now, the problem was that the group they were working with couldn't come to the garden. They were mostly housebound. So they made them a box, and into the box they put a little watering can, some string, some seeds, some compost, some plant pots, and then some instructions about planting these seeds. And then each person in their home found a windowsill or some space, and they did the instructions. And they at the time they set the project up, they were a little bit apprehensive. They weren't sure whether it was going to be very effective. It was a really difficult challenge for them, but they were absolutely amazed at the response that they got from these groups. Connecting with this process of growing was just amazing. Now, what turns that from being an interesting, enjoyable project into something that's transformative is having an opportunity then to express the experience, right? So you've got those two pieces. You've got the experience itself, however you can make that work, but you must have the piece on the other side, which is to give them a chance to tell their story and to have their story heard. That's really important. And then you kind of complete the circle and you get the meaning and the transformation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Many key takeaways from this discussion, I think. Are there other questions that have been unanswered? There is one, is this dualism? We restore nature and nature restores us. Is it dualism?
Yeah.
It is.
Because I would say, I mean, perhaps the word nature is a problem. Maybe that's the problem. We restore nature. I would be more specific. I would have the key word here is reciprocity, reciprocal. So yeah, I might have a relationship with a tree, and I might draw a lot of comfort from that tree in lots of different ways, biologically, but also metaphorically. I might draw comfort. I might just like the smell. Who knows? I might draw from the tree. And at the same time, sitting there under the tree, I'm breathing out carbon dioxide, which the tree is breathing in. And I might, because I've got a relationship with this tree, I might protect it. I might look after it. I might try and stop other people from damaging it. I might campaign if somebody wanted to come and cut it down. So that would be a reciprocal relationship. Now, every creature on Earth lives in reciprocity with every other creature on Earth. That's how it works at some scale or another. So I would agree. Yeah, when we restore nature, nature restores us. I would agree with that. I think that's probably true. But the word nature is difficult, but it's also a endless debate. What is nature?
Of course, philosophical. I think you many takeaways I think that we have, and we will have a chance to reflect and write our key takeaways, questions, etc. later. Maybe you would like to move on then for your concluding remarks, or other ideas that this discussion might have generated in you?
Well, look, one thing that I wanted to say that I thought about in the break was we've talked a lot about this non-dualism and part of nature, blah, blah, blah. And I think that a good way of illustrating it is this is a thing that happens a lot. It's a good illustration of language use, is we often talk about reconnecting to nature or connecting to nature. And I think that's very interesting because we can't reconnect to nature. We'll never be able to reconnect to nature because we already are connected to nature. We are nature. So it's a bit like it kind of doesn't make sense, this idea of reconnecting to nature. What we can do though is we can start. I think the problem where we're at now is it's not that we're disconnected from nature, it's that we feel disconnected from nature, right? That's the important point. So the work here is not to reconnect to nature, because that just suggests we're not part of nature. We have to reconnect with it. But what we do need to do is find ways of feeling like we're connected, of remembering we're connected, which is really easy to do through experience. Really an easy way to do it. So I just wanted to name that, where that language, reconnecting to nature, is really quite dangerous. What we need to say is feeling like we are part of nature. We need to, in our culture especially, we feel as if we're disconnected from it, but we need to feel like we're part of it, and then that will really help things. So that was just one little thing.
Great. And allow me a very, very quick one, because now you brought up the subject. Are children more connected to nature, as the biophilia theory suggests? Do you agree with that?
Well, look, I think they feel more connected, but I think the important thing here is that they feel less connected to culture, right? So as adults, we've gone through the educational system, we've watched all the adverts, we've seen Disney films, and we've been told that we can just go and stroke bears because they do on the Disney. We've had years and years and years of cultural conditioning that tells us that we're separate from nature. Whereas if you're 4 years old, that's never happened. All you're doing is feeling that you're part of it and responding. That's what you do. So it's not so much that they are more connected to nature, but they are less connected to all those forces that make adults feel disconnected. Does that make sense?
A lot.
So the culture is the thing to work on there. Get rid of their phones. Yeah.
So over to you, David, for your remarks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Look, I've just got a couple of things to say, really. So the practice of ecopsychology is ecotherapy. Ecopsychology is like the theory, the foundation, and ecotherapy is the practice. That's how I like to think about it. And ecotherapy means ecological therapy. It's one of those words that crushes two other words together. Ecological therapy. Now, what that means is it's about healing our relationships with the rest of nature. Okay? That's what it's about. The word healing comes from I think it's an old Germanic word. The etymology is an old Germanic word of Harlan, which literally means holing, so becoming whole. That's what it means. Okay? I think that when we go outdoors and we're close, we can really feel the rest of nature. We experience that we're part of it. We experience ourselves as part of something bigger. We essentially feel more whole. So that is what is healing. The fact that we are feeling more whole. That same experience of feeling whole can really motivate us to want to live sustainably, because we understand we're part of the rest of nature, and that we've got to live like we're part of the rest of nature in order to survive. So there's this nice relationship here between being outdoors, therapeutic outcomes, and learning for sustainability. These three things sit together in a triangle, and they're all about healing. So healing our relationships with the rest of nature. So any process that contributes to that is ecotherapy. So if you're a conservation worker and you plant trees, you are healing relationships with the rest of nature. If you work in community development and you're working on a sustainability project, for example, you're healing relationships with the rest of nature. If you work in communications or campaigning, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to heal relationships with the rest of nature. The whole environmental movement is trying to heal our relationships with the rest of nature. So what you get is that I think most of us here are educationalists in one form or another. I think of myself more as an educationalist than as a therapist, for sure. And I think that learning for sustainability is ecotherapy. It's about healing. It's not learning about stuff. It's about experiencing ourselves as something. It's a healing process. So really, we're all ecotherapists. That's the punchline. That's and doing that work, the more we learn about ecology and the more we learn about psychology, particularly the practice of psychology, the better able we are to work with those healing relationships, whether we're an educationalist, conservationist, a therapist, or working in communications or whatever it might be.
Great. We have these comments here, so beautiful and so you put us into thinking, not exactly questioning, but rethinking our own way of thinking, phrasing things, communicating things, doing our education work, everything. I think we now are in the process of rethinking everything in new terms. Yes,